What's up, guys? It's Dr. Tim Jackson with a very special guest today. All of our guests are special, but this one's very special. Something near and dear to my heart, the immune system, an immune-centric approach to fat loss. You've been told to eat less, move more, just work out, just eat healthy. We all know that that doesn't work, right? I mean, that's part of it. You need to do that. But the immune system, that is a huge part, not just in fighting pathogens, but in mediating fat loss. So the author of the Immunity Code, Mr. Joel Greene.
While I make every effort to broadcast correct information, I'm also still learning. I will double check all my facts, but realize that healthcare is a constantly changing science and art. One doctor or healthcare provider may have a different way of doing things from another. I welcome any comments, suggestions, or correction of errors. I take no money from supplement or device companies. By listening to this podcast or reading this blog, you agree not to use this podcast or blog as medical advice or to treat any medical condition in either yourself or others, including but not limited to patients that you are treating. Consult your healthcare provider for any medical issues that you may be having. This entire disclaimer also applies to any guests or contributors to the podcast or the website. Under no circumstances shall any guests or contributors to the podcast or blog or any employees, associates, or affiliates of the Boss Body podcast be responsible for damages arising from use of the podcast or the blog. This blog or podcast should not be used in any legal capacity whatsoever, including but not limited to establishing the standard of care in a legal sense or as a basis for expert witness testimony. No guarantee is given regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast or the blog.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dr. Tim. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So tell us a little about your background and what drew you to gut health and the immune-centric approach.
I had been a consumer most of my life, just trying to apply the advice that everybody was getting in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. And I had about 30 years in of what you would call, consumer fitness, meaning I was not paid to do that. I was just, like reading magazines and like, oh, I'll try this now.
Right.
And it had always been a passion. And I wound up running a technology company in the early 2000s, kind of that typical startup story, where you're working 7 days a week, nights, weekends, blah, 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 all that. And so the interesting thing was going into that job, I was really lean. I mean, I was 5% body fat. I was lean. What had happened is I was in the .com boom, and I got fired from my .com job. The company fell apart, and I had some time to work out, and I went to work just building websites for fitness models. So I had some time. Because I had time, I really got in shape. So I go into this job, I'm really in shape. And then the startup grind, 14, 15-hour days, stress, massive stress every day. And it's one of those stories you hear quite a bit where, your revenue shoots through the roof, and your weight exactly matches the revenue curve. It just goes straight up like that. So it wasn't like I was sitting on some need to go on a health journey and change my life. I had been doing it my entire life. But what I found was that all of the advice I'd been given, kind of the eat less, move more, work out, lift heavy things, don't eat processed food, all that. What I found is it just didn't work under real life circumstances. So when you put that to the fire and you took away the one variable it all depends on, which is time, and then you added in all this chaos, which is, typical day, walk into the office, there's a voicemail waiting, our primary revenue source has decided to change the terms of our contract, and it impacts all, these kinds of things every single day. So you throw chaos in the mix, and I gained a ton of weight, and during that time I was, I was still working out, but the difference was all of these variables no one ever accounts for. So I was getting older. I was turning 40. I was didn't have quite the energy I used to have, didn't have quite the recovery I used to have, had tons of stress, and things I know now that played in later, actually, just a couple of years later, played in significantly, which was the way that the the microbiome meets the human immune system and the gut immune axis, and how that really plays a big role in things. And so all of these things kind of led me to this place of like, I put all this time believing all this stuff, and it didn't work. And it wasn't like I wasn't lifting weights at the end of that run. It was
Right.
a three-year run. I was actually bigger than I'd ever been in my whole life, lifting heavier weights than I'd ever lifted. I was just fat. So
Yeah.
so that changed everything for me, and it put me on a different road that led to at first I was just trying to produce really good content because I believed that this was the pre-YouTube
Right.
peak search engine optimization years of 2006,
Right.
2007, before YouTube became a thing.
Right.
And what I noticed was that people who had no history or no experience, nothing to do with health, but were really good marketers, were able to optimize web pages and get the #1 ranking for everything. And so, this kind of consumer driven, the answer is Garcinia Cambogia,
Right.
the answer is this thing, was dominating. And I started this website based on what I called longevity based fitness, which kind of became in a way the longevity movement. And truthfully, nobody really cared. Like, I would write all this stuff about, like, a longevity based approach, eating for longevity, all this stuff.
Right.
And that's where the microbiome thing came in. So it was about 2007, and you can go look this article up right now. I mean, it was
Sure.
I published a series of articles on the microbiome and weight loss, and to my knowledge, nobody had ever really honed in on that at that point. And it led me into this diet experiment, using basically a lot of cruciferous veggies to feed the microbiome. And it was pretty shocking results. So I had spent that year trying to trim down from my 257, 260 that I was at. And I'd gotten down about 229, primarily just through exercise, just a bunch of
Right.
exercise, bunch of time. And then the crazy thing was, in 7 days, I went from 229 to 212, and I had my
Wow.
body fat measured. And this was a water immersion test for body fat, which is fairly accurate.
Right.
And I was in the 6% range for body fat. And this was at age 42. And it was the biggest thing about it that I noticed was a couple things. One, my bowel movements kind of turned a little bit green and didn't smell at all. None. Zero. And my energy skyrocketed, shot through the roof. And what I had done was I had taken in so much substrate to feed commensal bacteria that I'd had this massive rapid shift in the gut, and that really facilitated a lot of the fat loss. And so that turned into this journey that turned into a software that turned into these big corporate wellness gigs. And so I was doing these very large corporate wellness engagements with big cities like Phoenix, thousands of people.
Mhm.
And because it was a software, I could kind of harvest data, so I could kind of see protocol wise what was working, what was effective, and what wasn't. And out of that, I was able to basically inventory some protocols that became the basis of the immunity code, which really centered around the gut immune axis and really two bacteria. So what I talk about a lot in the immunity code is that there's all this talk about diversity and all these different bacteria, but really you just need to focus on two bacteria, and that was the family of Bifido and then Akkermansia mucinalpha, which we now see is becoming a family. There's different strains in there, but basically by focusing on feeding those two bacteria, that you essentially interface with the human gut immune axis through dendritic cells and through antigen signaling and through IgA and through all these different metabolites, through bile acid metabolism, through GLP-1. So there were so many things endemic to metabolism that you hit on by just focusing on those two bacteria, that you could really cover a lot of ground, which my goal basically coming out of that whole period of my life was the time investment stuff didn't work because it only kind of really works if that's what you get paid to do. That's where it really works. But it doesn't really work when you deal with people in real life situations, it's much more complex. There's a lot more chaos coming at them, and I lived it, so nobody could tell me that's not true. But so kind of what I figured out from that was that there was a missing foundation. The 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 makeup or the base alloy of that foundation needed to be things that required little to zero time, that you could always do, and that you were going to have seasons where time would go to zero, and then you'd have seasons where you'd have more time and you could work out more. But if we didn't account for the seasons when time goes to zero, and if we didn't hit the most powerful mechanisms in the body, that everybody's basically on an uphill climb with weight gain, no matter what they're doing. And that was kind of where it all kind of came together.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Question about your software. So I think you mentioned it in the book, collecting the data. What data points were you mostly looking at?
I was looking at protocols primarily related to body composition. So what would happen is I'd look at some study, the one that really stood out was there was a study in 2009 called, I think the title was Cruciferous Vegetables, or rather human gut communities are rapidly modifiable by cruciferous vegetables. So that was kind of like a mainstay one. And so I would just, okay, well, great. Let me stack these cruciferous vegetables here. We'll fast here. We'll do this here. So I could make these changes. And then just by the data, I could see if it was working or not. And I could just pull large numbers of data and look at, oh, wow. Okay. So we're ticking up our averages.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so corporate wellness, you were working with people, designing diet plans, workout plans, supplementation plans, and you were able to sort of see what worked, what didn't in terms of shifting body composition.
Well, it wasn't individualized. It was a software, and what the software did was individualize the person. So I wasn't actually interfacing with the people doing, kind of what you think of as coaching. It was more they had a software program and they would put their data into that, and then and so we had some very large engagements. In fact, our first customer was a very large hospital, Excella Health, out in Pennsylvania.
Oh wow!
And it was all medical professionals in the very first big engagement.
Oh, wow. That's impressive. And is the software still available?
No. So what I found out, so note to self or note to anybody, never do a software unless you raise 20 million bucks. That was my experience. So I self-funded it initially and then got some investors, but I mean, the amount of money I raised was not even a 15th of what you needed to do a software, because when you're doing a software, basically the bulk of your costs are going to the engineers to do the programming. And so you got two options. They can either be on site or they can be overseas. If they're overseas, you don't really control the code. And you have all these issues related to that. If they're on site, you're looking, in today's market, you're looking at about $1 million for two guys, per year. So anyways, what happened was, it got to the point where I just could not keep up the expense related to growing the code, and it was much easier to put the information in courses, and so that's what it morphed to. So yeah.
Well, awesome. I'm about halfway through the book, The Immunity Code. I highly encourage everyone to pick it up. You have a little blurb on the front from one of the producers from the Dr. Phil show saying how it changed his life and changed the trajectory of everything he did around health, which was, really inspiring to see. And now you have the young gut, the young body, and what's the third product called?
It's Young Reds, Young Gut, Young Body. So that began in the 20 teens as the basic gut reset protocol. And it really came out of, I had a little brother with Down syndrome, and I needed to help him. And he had gone into Parkinson's kind of later in life, and it really changed him. I mean, really changed him. Like, I'm sure you're familiar, you've seen Parkinson's symptomology, and it just affects everything. So it affects personality, affects everything. So, and he had gone from being like the happiest little guy in the world to kind of withdrawn, and it wasn't good. So so what came out of that was experimenting with some protocols to rapidly recolonize the gut, and there weren't any products for that at the time. So I was using baby formula and red phenol powder, and whatever I could cobble together. And
Right.
anyway, suffice to say that that is what became the immunity code gut reset, where we're going after Akkermansia and Bifido, and it's just morphed now over the years where I've got some really good product sets that do it without having to cobble together baby formula and other things. So
Yeah, absolutely. And so let's talk about the gut immune axis. I mean, most people know now. I mean, like you mentioned, the gut health was not popular. I started studying gut health early 2005.
wow,
By
that's early.
now, yeah. So I was an early adopter. I was called a quack on more than one equation. But it is what it is, right? Like it's easy to do something when everyone else is doing it. But to do it, I mean, I wasn't the first. Like it sounds like you were probably the first, and a few other people out there in the functional medicine space. But I'll tell you the story. I was supplementing with Lactobacillus acidophilus, and I was just taking it like candy. And it did some good, but then I did a gut test, and my D-lactate levels were off the chart, and I was having brain fog, fatigue, and the point being, you want to try and support the bacteria that are already there, provide the fuel and the substrate for those guys to grow. I think probiotics don't work the way most people think. It's not like we take them, they colonize the gut. It's more of a transitory effect. And if you don't have the right substrates in place, then nothing's going to happen. So I would say, would you agree that the prebiotics and the substrates are more important than
Oh, by
taking a
far,
probiotic?
yeah. By far,
Yeah,
yeah. Like, I sell a little kit of supplements. I could sell any supplement I wanted. I'm sure you could
right,
too. I don't sell any probiotics because what I've seen over the years, three things. Number one, without a physician guidance, consumers tend to treat them like candy and they
right,
misuse them unknowingly, and they wind up with
right,
problems later on that are much harder to fix, SIBO, things like
right,
that. Um, so their indiscriminate use is not a great thing. The other thing is that what we call nutrition today, it's probably by and large, I'd say 20 years behind where it should or could be. And you pointed out one of the most important aspects that's missing, which is accounting for changes over time. So
right,
such that you can, and this is there with when you look at like, drugs, like a lot of the literature is rife with like, yeah, well, short term it'll do this, but long term this is negative and you got to watch that. But that's missing when you talk about diet and nutrition with people. There's
right.
none of that. There's just like, no, the keto diet's the way, or the carnivore
Yeah,
diet's the way, or veganism is the way. And there's no accounting for the forces that take place over time where you can maybe accumulate too much of a given bacteria in the wrong place, or you could
right,
degrade the gut lining from that, or all these forces of time. And
right,
so with probiotics, what I've come to with that is I think that particularly single strains for very specific outcomes, directed by a doctor, is the next big thing. I think that's wondrous. I think the
right,
indiscriminate use of them and sticking them in anything and everything is disastrous. And so substrate really I've just found is the way to go, where you don't overdo it. You provide optimal but not excessive amounts of substrate to feed the
right,
right bacteria, and optimal but not excessive is another issue. So
right,
with that, a problem, another, in my opinion, another problem is the word daily. So, you see that plastered on everything, like take this daily. It's probably not a very good idea to take most things, if anything, daily. One reason being, particularly when it comes to the gut, you can overdo it. You can,
yeah,
and I've seen that lactate problem many times. You just,
right,
from overdoing it, you get too much lactate production in the gut, and
right,
it works different ways. You can do carnivore too long, and you get too much ammonia
right,
in the gut. You get too much Akkermansia. You get all these problems. So yeah,
right.
it's yeah, we're singing, drinking from the same cup here. So
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point about keto, I think keto can be used like especially for certain neurological conditions, for a specific amount of time. But long term, when we talk about, say, proteolytic fermentation, saccharolytic fermentation, and how our body produces those short chain fatty acids, the people I see with the most deranged gut microbiomes, and I know I'm going to get nasty messages from this, but it's people on long term keto, because you don't have the right substrates. And even a lot of the people who started out hardcore keto are now saying, okay, you probably need some vegetables, right?
So this is where, again, back, what we call nutrition is about 20 years behind where it should be. This
Right.
touches on so many important topics, what you just talked about here. So let's go down the list here. So number one is saccharolytic versus proteolytic fermentation. So I have heard famous, keto influencers and carnivore influencers argue that, or equivocate to say that there's no difference between the two. That is so absurd. First of all,
Yeah.
I can't believe anybody that's telling me that has ever looked at those pathways.
Right.
So your end products are totally different. On the
Right.
saccharolytic side, you're going to get antioxidants, you're going to get butyrate, propionate, acetate in the right ratios, and you have a salvage pathway going from acetate back to acetyl-CoA, and that gets you more butyrate. So your ratios of butyrate to acetate are optimal. The other thing that gets left out of that picture is that the lining of the gut needs to be highly oxidizing in a normal state, and it's very easy to push it too far over the edge. So antioxidants play a really important role, and just small shifts in the regular intake of antioxidants can overly oxidize the interior of the gut lining. So you see issues from that. Then when you look at the other side of the equation, so the proteolytic side, you have different pathways. They're not all the same. You have the ketogenic pathway, you have the lysine pathway. Some of those don't have the acetate salvage, and you get
Right.
ammonia as your end product. So you're not getting the ratios of antioxidants. Instead, you're getting something that in its accrual is very detrimental, which is ammonia. And then the ratios are different of
Right.
propionate, acetate, all those things.
Right.
So there's that. That's a
Mhm.
problem. That's not the biggest
Yeah.
problem. The biggest problem is I don't think anybody that's saying that's ever actually looked at the TCA cycle.
Right.
So you cannot, in a sustained environment, run beta oxidation forever. And the
Right.
reason is that when you increase beta oxidation, you're not increasing TCA cycle flux. So your ATP output is not increasing relative to the increases in beta oxidation. So the
Right.
net of that is that your raw material you need, which is oxaloacetate, to handle all that extra acetyl-CoA from beta ox isn't there. So the net of
Right.
that is we get this buildup of intermediates, particularly acylcarnitines. So as those
Mhm.
acylcarnitines build up, they disrupt insulin function. So
Mhm.
that's why those excess fatty acids are shuttled off to the liver to make ketones. So that's all fine and good short term, but long term, you're talking very significant changes from trying to run beta oxidation as a way of life
Right.
that are not sustainable. And this is
Right.
basic stuff. I mean, this is like, this is high school chemistry, or this is high school biology. I mean,
Right.
so yeah, when you break those arguments down, what we have is those are very, very effective and highly utilitarian protocols, very useful for short-term outcomes. As a way of life, they are substantially flawed.
Right. Absolutely. And to your point, like one thing that I've gotten on your from your book that I've noticed in the gym myself, albeit a few years when I had some health challenges, I've been lifting weights since I was 18. And I typically go 4 to 5 times a week now and do some interval training as well. But I see a lot of people who are fit, but they're not healthy. And, to that point, I mean, you can get fit without getting healthy, but if you aim for health, the fitness will come almost always as a byproduct, as long as you're moving, right? But I see some people, especially if they're doing fitness competitions, they're, cutting calories to the point they're going into a hypometabolic state, Wilson's temperature syndrome, cortisol, HPA axis dysfunction, so many things. And so I think because there are guys who are benching 405 pounds for 10 reps at my gym, but it looks like they haven't had a bowel movement in a decade. And, I try to talk because they all think that I'm on gear. I'm not. But, I'm like, just think about your mineral status, your gut health, like everything's immune mediated, right? Even workout recovery. Talk to us about the immune interface with workout recovery.
Well, the first thing to understand is that the immune system governs workout recovery because you're sustaining, you know, in sarcomeres, you're sustaining injury. Okay, those
Mhm.
are injuries when you're training. You know, so with any injury, there's a process of immune onset, inflammatory onset, recruitment, and then resolution. So if we just think about that, like for a second, I mean, this is basic, and it's shocking that like this isn't just the way everybody approaches it. But if you think about that, so post workout, immediately we need as much onset of inflammation as we can get. And it's interesting when you look at the young versus the old, there's very clear differences in the way inflammation onsets and the way it resolves. So in the young, you get a lot of recruitment early on, a lot of inflammatory onset. So interleukin 1B, interleukin 1/6 do their thing, TNF alpha, all that does its thing. And then it resolves. And you grow muscle. In the old, that doesn't happen. You get instead you get this slow progressive onset that doesn't resolve.
Right.
Okay. So if we just look at the signals that we need, it's not that hard. It's not that complex to just say, okay, well, we need a little more. We need as much inflammatory recruitment as we can post workout. That's easy.
Mhm.
Like go in the heat sauna post workout. Take some citrulline post workout. Drive as much interleukin 6, interleukin 1B as you can. But then 24 hours later, that's when resolution needs to start taking place. And so then that's when we need, you know, antioxidants, glutathione. We need everything we can to basically flip the script. In there, what's kind of interesting is the Yamanaka factors can play a very interesting role. So there's a really good case, and I don't know, you know, in the book I make the case it's right around 8 hours, but who knows? You know, we know that somewhere in that range. So a lot of the factors involved in stem cell repletion and youth and longevity play a role. And so vitamin C can have a very interesting place in that, but it's how you time it.
Right.
There's been some research recently that vitamin C post workout is not a bad thing, but that's because it can be it can be oxidative or it can be an antioxidant, just
Right.
depending. But generally, it seems like the place for vitamin C is a little bit later in the recovery cycle, where it can play a really interesting role, interfacing with like TET2 and some of these Yamanaka factors. But the basic idea is just we're just looking at signals. We're just looking at, you know, what are the inflammatory signals that we know of, and when do they? It's what, when, and how. What are we
Right.
looking for? When does it go on, and how do we activate it? And
Right.
the how part's really not that complex, I don't think.
Right. Yeah, those are all great points. I mean, interleukin 6, TNF alpha, I mean, those are the guys, you know, during COVID, everyone became familiar with the phrase cytokine storm. It became part of our vernacular. And most people, you know, if we've had a cold or the flu and you're on the couch, that's cytokine induced sickness behavior, right? The interleukin 6, TNF alpha, interleukin 1 beta make you feel like crud. But it's not that you don't want any inflammation, you want a balanced inflammatory response, correct?
Yeah, it's about when do we
Right.
want it? You know, that I would offer. For example, with with the cytokine storm of COVID, the thing that you wanted to be careful of was kind of, you know, if you were worried about that post workout, like time on the treadmill, you did 40, 60 minutes on a treadmill. So you got a little bit of, you know, a little bit of inflammatory onset, a little bit of that. And if you had COVID, then that's what could be an issue that could potentiate the cytokine storm.
Right.
Um, so yeah.
Absolutely. And a couple other variables I picked up on your book that you talk about a lot is hypoxia inducible factor. Talk to us
Yeah.
about HIF. What is it and
Mm-hmm.
why is it
Mm-hmm.
important?
Yeah. So what I characterize in the book is a interesting foundation to maybe move into this next era of immune-centric health is to take a couple of the big players in the immune system, which are basically macrophages and hypoxia, which is mediated by hypoxia inducible factor 1. And the big picture is this, that immune cells are very similar to cancer cells in some respects. Primarily that when the immune system needs to be activated, you need a sudden recruitment, you need a sudden onset and explosion of immune cells. So that's very similar to the way cancer works. When you get an onset, you get this rapid proliferation. So not surprisingly, you need the same fuel source. So you need a boatload of glycolysis. And typically your mediator helping immune cells or helping cells in general switch into glycolysis is the body's backup system for when oxygen is low, which is HIF1. These are enzymes mediated by prolohydroxylase. And what happens is when they turn on, you get this massive gene recruitment, particularly VEGF. And so you get all of these genes that turn up that are basically related to making energy from glycolysis. And so the thing about HIF1, the consumer argument for HIF1 you'll find in all these discussions about CO2 versus oxygen. So there's the Buteyko school of thought, which is no, CO2 is the thing you need. You need more CO2. You don't need more oxygen, blah, 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 blah. Well, they're right to a degree, which is that HIF1 is neither good nor bad. And there's times when it can be highly beneficial, particularly in certain tissues. But there's times when the oversubscription of HIF1, which is the hypoxia protein, is not such a great thing, where you don't want cells engaging in sustained hypoxia because they're in Warburg metabolism. And that's not such a great thing. So it's one of the reasons why HIF1 can be a cancer promoter, because the cells begin to take on, a cancer profile. But however, all that to say, there are a few conspicuous places where you can target HIF1 for good or bad. For good, I would offer is post-workout or end of workout with hypoxic breathing. And so there's times when hypoxic breathing, in other words, just not getting enough air but doing it under stress, is really beneficial. And we've seen studies with altitude where people, basically you get more energy, and you should. You're conscripting more glycolysis in the body. Helps you lean up, all these really great things. So it's just a question of what, when, and how. Where do we want to stick it? And one of the best places is right at the end of a workout. So the body's already oxygen low. And then if you add in some hypoxic breathing techniques where you're essentially just kind of holding your breath in intervals, then you're increasing everything that we want to increase to help the recovery process. And so it can be very beneficial there. The other place that I point out in the book where we probably want to work on ameliorating it is during sleep. So that's the big issue, is getting hypoxic during sleep and having SAT levels drop during sleep. And so in the immunity code, like one of the first things you go for is we want to look at are you desatting during sleep? So for the average person, I've seen this, I'm sure you've seen it thousands of times. The average person, as they get older, they're desatting like crazy during their sleep. And that is the easiest fix that gets the most bang for the buck, where you get them to stop desatting during sleep. Because what you're doing otherwise is you're stabilizing HIF1. And the practical outcome that you see with that is when they wake up, so when the cell reoxygenates, you get this massive inflammatory response. And so that translates into, like, in the morning, they're like old people are really stiff in the morning. It's because one of the reasons you're hypoxic at night, most of the night. Then you start to reoxygenate in the morning, and boom, everything gets inflamed. It takes you 2-3 hours to get out of it. So just the simple adding some hypoxic breathing post-workout, and then getting you via whatever technique to stop desatting at night, those are non-time intensive things involving HIF1 that have massive beneficial consequences.
Absolutely. And to your point, one thing you mentioned in the book, obviously you wrote the book, but it's about chewing hard things. And so I have a book right here, actually, 6-Foot Tiger, 3-Foot Cage. It's about decreased maxillary width, from not breastfeeding long enough, not chewing, hard things. And we stop growing our maxilla, which when you measure from tooth 3 to tooth 14 should be about 42 millimeters optimally. Most people are about 36, 37. And so they're hypoxic at night. And the reason I got into functional medicine is I had what I now know to be an unnecessary jaw surgery when I was a senior in undergrad, where they broke both my upper and lower jaw, and they took bone from my lower jaw and added it to my maxilla. But they did the opposite of what you want to do with the mandible. They brought it up and back.
Yeah.
The concept is called centric relations, and it's a flawed concept because you're reducing the amount of real estate the tongue has. And then when you lay supine, the tongue's falling down the trachea. And so, by the way, if you're saying, well, I had a sleep study and it was negative, go to an airway centric dentist. That's who fixed mine. In my experience, the pulmonologist missed it. He said, oh, well, you're snoring, but we don't always treat that. And I said, well, therein lies the problem. So I got an oral appliance, no longer considered having sleep apnea. I also wear nasal mutes to keep my nasal passages patent. But you talk about chewing hard things for jaw development, which I think is extremely important. Talk to us about that and oxygenation.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you. It is the dentists who are focusing on the airway that are really at the forefront of this. And we've been fortunate enough that my wife worked for one of those for a number of years. And so back in the mid 20 teens, he was way into, Bukako and collapse of the airway and all that. And it really, are you familiar with Vivos?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. My wife's been doing Vivos for a few years now.
Oh,
She had
wow.
the narrowest palate, and it's absolutely remarkable. Like
Yeah,
remarkable what it's done. I mean, it regrows the bones of the face. She stops snoring. It's just, so all that to say is just, with age, everything is kind of winding down, and something that for so many years nobody really thought about was the proper structure internally in the face. Like the structure of
right.
the face lends itself out to the structure of the airway. And what most of us are going through is the collapse of the cheekbones, the shrinking of the jaw, the narrowing of the palate, and all that stuff. As you said, you're depriving the airway of real estate in order to do its thing. And
Yes.
one of the simplest things that's missing is just chewing hard things, because when our ancestors didn't have meat tenderizers and didn't have, microwaves. And so there was a whole lot of that, a lot. And what it does is you're
Right.
getting all this epigenetic stimulation in the bones of the face. So the analogy would be like, if you just took up running, you're going to have a very dense bone structure just from the
Mhm.
pounding, because it's an epigenetic activator. It's the same thing with the bones of the face. So chewing hard things is a bone activator, and that shrinking of the jaw that happens with age, there are definitely ways to counter it. And hard chewing is probably the big dumb one, but
Yeah.
there's all these great new technologies out now that can also do that. And also just, I think it's changed dentistry, because they used to want to get up there and just pull stuff, and now they know better that, well, that might not be a great idea later in life. Like removing, these teeth
Right.
can cause this to collapse. So yeah, it's really fascinating, the revolution I've seen, and you've seen as well, in dentistry, airway dentistry.
Yeah.
As a result, it's absolutely terrific and fantastic.
And the analogy you gave with chewing stuff, you said if you have something, and I didn't catch the word.
Oh, I think I just said like things that are really stiff and hard, like
Okay.
what the example I use in the book is, which is kind of a convenient thing. There's a little fat loss thing you can do in the book to work on the gut, and it involves chewing a whole bunch of green beans. And just the
Right.
net of it is, it's so much work to chew.
Right.
You'll be 45 minutes into chewing, and the muscles here are popping out the side of your head, and it's just
Yeah.
rare that we get the foods we have nowadays are so soft. We've deprived
Right.
an important ancestral domain, which is things that take a lot of effort to chew.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's awesome that your wife is doing that work. And is she still in dentistry?
She retired a few years ago, but she's still in. She is the second hardest case Vivos has ever seen, because her palate was so narrow. Most people are in and out of it in 12 months. And for those of you not familiar, Vivos is a jaw appliance that pushes the jaw out, and it takes the bone structure of the face with it. So it's a
Right.
beautifying thing. It really
Yeah.
works. I mean, I've seen it work. It's amazing.
Yeah, it is truly amazing. My surgery, as bad as it was, for the upper jaw, my maxilla, it widened it, but I still have some hardware in here, so I can't expand my lower jaw. So I have a mandibular advancement appliance
Wow.
that brings the mandible down and forward. And I had a revision surgery at the University of Pennsylvania. The guy, he's as holistic and integrative as he can be without getting kicked out of academia. But he said, I'll go in, I'll take out as many screws as I can, but I don't want to, any screws that are osseointegrated with bone around them, you don't want to break them off. That's going to cause you more pain. I said, okay, just do what you can. And so he took out, I think, like 7 or 8 screws, and I still have like that many in there, which is okay. But yeah, the Vivos is great. That's why I tell people, before you go see any sort of healthcare provider, ask yourself, what do they have to offer you? Because, in hindsight, if I was 20 again or 21 and I was told, this is literally what they told me, I wouldn't have any teeth by the time I was 30 if I didn't have the surgery. So, now
Mm,
I know enough to say that's complete BS. But then I'm like, oh, can we do the surgery like right away? Because you're
mm.
scared out of your mind. But he only had one thing to offer, surgery, right? So oral appliances weren't even on his radar. And now, I mean, there's a few people locally who do them, but my buddy, who's an orthodontist by training, when he lectures all around the country, his business partner is the co-author of a book called Gasp, about airway health. And he tells dentists, forget about the teeth, like forget about the teeth, literally. Having perfectly straight white teeth, that's great if and only if you also have a healthy airway. But what's more important from a life quality of life standpoint, a healthy airway or perfectly straight teeth? And if you look at animals in nature, crooked teeth they're pretty rare, right? I mean, for the most part. And so there's a bioanthropological lab in Paris, and a PA I know from New Mexico. She's spoken with them, and this lady, she does cadaver dissections and looks at skull health and width. And she said, the skulls, the width, the maxillary width continues to shrink. If we're not chewing hard things. And veterinary medicine in that regard is more advanced because they tell you, oh, make sure your dogs are eating some hard food as they age, so they can maintain good dental health.
It's fascinating as you look around at these sort of peripheral schools of of medicine. They're all more advanced than when you're talking about just nutrition, which we would think human
Yeah.
nutrition would be the most. It's actually the one that's the most behind.
Right.
I actually had my skull measured for Vivos, and they found my front is a few millimeters in back of where it should be. So what we're going to be doing is there's a new laser that takes as we age, and this gets into dentistry stuff I don't know very well, but there's a muscle back here or tissue that tends to grow a little bit and block the airway. They're going to laser that down, and that's painless. You probably know about this. I don't know as
Yeah.
much. And then I'll go into Vivos after that. So the first step is to just get rid of the excess tissue in the airway, and then the
Mhm.
next will be probably about 12 months in Vivos just to kind of widen things back out.
Yeah. And I mean, you're already super healthy, but you're going to get even healthier. And people forget that, oxygen, without oxygen, you're not going to be able to accomplish anything. I mean, glutathione's great. I love it. I love prebiotics. I love molecular hydrogen, which I'm breathing now, but without oxygen, and if you don't have good maxillary width, you won't be able to fully oxygenate your body. And so it impacts, your risk for heart attack, strokes, neurodegenerative conditions, erectile dysfunction, depression, anxiety, enuresis, bedwetting in kids. I mean, the list goes on from jaw issues and sleep disordered breathing. And the other thing is your wife, I'm sure, knows about this myofunctional therapy, retraining muscles of the face and the tongue. I haven't purchased it yet, but there's a device called
Oh yeah,
Remastered Sleep. Yeah,
yeah.
and it's about keeping the tongue, patent with the roof of your mouth. And I have a bit of a tongue tie, so at some point I'm going to get that lasered. And they already lasered the posterior tongue muscles. And all this is very non-invasive, ultimately very inexpensive compared to other medical treatments. And it's where there needs to be more communication. It really irritated the pulmonologist I saw because in order to get my insurance to cover my oral appliance, he's like, "You need CPAP." I said, "Listen, I'm not doing the CPAP." And he's like, "Well, the dentist can't fix it." I'm like, "Yes, you can. Just send the referral so my insurance will cover it." And there needs to be more collaboration and less ego because the airway-centric dentist, like, in fact, the lady I see, she doesn't have a dental hygienist in her office. She doesn't do regular dentistry. It's just all airway health. And so,
That's yeah, which I think is I mean what and maybe you could verify this as well. I don't know. Just what I have seen is a lot of the acceleration in aging that I've seen has to do with the decline of sleep quality onsetting kind of in the late 50s, going really big time in the 60s, related to just really lack of oxygenation during sleep. So you're desatting continually during the night, and you're waking up, 50, 60 times, an hour, sometimes just even little wake ups. And then the
Right.
problem with that eventually is those receptors, those hypoxia receptors in the back of the throat eventually get kind of what you would call insulin resistance. They get resistant to just noticing that. And then you have real problems. That
Yeah.
becomes a lot of other problems.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
that, in terms of an age accelerator, I would put that at the top of the list.
Yeah. And a lot of people don't even know how bad their sleep is until it's fixed. And then they're like, wow, my whole life I've not been sleeping well. And then the other thing, you've seen this, I'm sure, it's become a craze with mouth taping. But if you start mouth taping and you don't have good nasal patency, like you can do a test where you tilt your head back, take a deep breath in through the nose, and you'll see a lot of people, one of them, have a partial collapse of one of my nostrils. And so, you got to use something like nasal dilators or nasal mutes first, and you got to make sure there's no sleep apnea. There's a reason why we bring the mandible down and forward, or we use something like Vivos to expand it. But I think if you just jump to taping the mouth, it can really be problematic for people.
Interesting. Interesting.
I
My
know there was a
wife,
video that, sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
There was a video that was circulating around social media about 5 or 6 months ago. A guy, he used clear tape over his mouth, and he had the camera recording him while he slept, and he starts, struggling during the middle of the night, and he literally pulls it off.
Hmm. Yeah, interesting. I have, by and large, with the Seattle protocol, seen that just as a simple thing everybody can do, be a, kind of an entry level, pretty remarkable. But I agree with you. It definitely, there's this whole burgeoning thing with airway dentists where they can get in and scan you and recommend the right kind of appliance and prescriptives for that I think is super underserved. It really needs to
Yeah.
be kind of forefront. The other day I saw a guy um just at my church. He walks up and he's like, hey, starts asking me questions, and I started asking him a few questions, and I go, well, it sounds to me like because I have no energy in the morning, I don't even have energy till the afternoon, then I don't go to sleep late, and I'm like, it sounds to me like you're just waking completely desatted, and it's taking you, and so the restoration that should happen during sleep's happening in the first part of your day. So I told him how to run a sleep study, just go get a ring, some software. He was desatting 50 times an hour into the low 80s.
Wow.
Yeah, all
That's
night,
serious.
all night.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you were going to say something about your wife a minute ago.
Oh, the mouth taping and the nose strips changed her life, which is
Yeah.
amazing. Like, yeah, it just changed her life. She had all kinds of issues just related to improper airway flow, and but she's been through the whole gamut now of everything. But
She did the
yeah,
Vivos first, though, right?
no, she did the mouth taping and all the other
Okay.
stuff first, and then transitioned into Vivos. But it's been, if you were to take a look at her sleep now versus, and she looks really young. Like when you see
Mhm.
her, she just looks like, oh my gosh, you look way younger than you are. And a lot of it, I think, is just because she's aged super well, because she really started oxygenating super well during sleep.
Right. That's awesome. Yeah, that's a great story. And to combine those things, because obviously that's going to impact immune function if you're not sleeping. It's going to impact everything if your oxygen saturation goes way down. And if you go to a allopathic MD and they take your oxygen saturation and it's 94, 95, they're going to say, oh, that's fine, that's good. I mean, you're going to be alive, but you won't feel good, obviously.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like it should be, you really need to be 97, 98, most of the
Right.
night. Yeah. And it's a life changer. If you go from like, I've seen people who are kind of like, what's not generally known is the serum measurement is not linear with the tissue drop off. I mean, I'm sure you know this. I'm sure but the public at large doesn't know this. So
Right.
going from 91 to 90 is catastrophic. I mean, it sounds good. Like, oh, why was it 90? That's not bad. No, that's catastrophic. Your tissue
Yeah.
sat drop off is plummeting.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, that's so critical because you're not going to heal anything if you're not getting deep restorative sleep. In terms of something that you know today, you wish you would have known 10, maybe 12 years ago, what's one or two things?
Mm, that's a good one. So that was the 2012. Well, I would say like something that for me is like kind of a current focus is just the importance of VO2 max. So I didn't have the emphasis on that 12 years ago that I do now, which is that as a longevity tool, you're keeping your VO2 max at a what I would call a competition level. Is one of the most important things you can do that takes the least amount of time. And so you can hit your VO2 max in a minute. I mean, you could, you know, I'm not recommending anybody try and do this, but you could just, for example's sake, you could go run an all-out quarter mile. You're going to hit your VO2 max. You're going to be done for the entire day in 1 minute. Now, to make that a little more doable, you could hop on a Peloton for 2 minutes and go at your max, and you're going to be completely gassed. And so just even integrating that into your day, a little 2 minute interval, or even trying to work up, it just gets to as we get older, the vascular system's got two jobs. It's got to get oxygen and sugar into tissues. That's what it has to do. And so as we get older, the ability of the vasculature to get oxygen into tissues is going downhill. And so as much help as you can give the vasculature getting oxygen into tissues by having an extremely high level VO2 max is going to help your case a lot.
Right. That's a good point. I remember, and we'll end on this question. I remember, I think maybe 3 or 4 months ago on your Instagram page, you posted something along the lines of you're only as healthy as your endothelial lining.
Right.
So can you expand upon that?
Yeah, it's really critical. It's not something that's discussed a lot, but as
And
we
are you
age,
referring to the glycocalyx?
the whole set of structures in there. So the endothelial lining, really that's the barrier that's tasked with importing into tissues oxygen and sugar. And so as we age, what's happening is at the same time, you have this kind of cascade failure of multiple structures in there. So top of the list is the enzymes that vasodilate, which are the NOx or the NADPH oxidases. So the only oxidating enzymes that we know of in the body, um, they are critical to just about everything we can think of. So you have all these isoforms of the NOx enzymes, and basically their job is to make free radicals and help the vasculature vasodilate, but they're also involved in feedback loops for insulin signaling and all these other things. And as we get old, they start to kind of just hyperactivate. And so you're making way too much reactive oxygen species. And this is sort of accelerating the decline of the vasculature as a whole. And at the same time, the glycocalyx, which is the hairy structures inside the endothelium, tends to essentially wind down and get destroyed. And so all of this together, and at the same time, the ability to produce nitric oxide is going downhill, and the bioavailability of nitric oxide within the endothelium is going downhill. So you have this kind of three-way disaster train running into a collision. And all of that basically is just accelerating the aging process and everything about it. So it's driving disrupted insulin function. It's driving vascular disease. It's changing the mechanics of diet. So where once in your diet, saturated fats would have maybe been no problem, they can become a real problem for someone whose vasculature is in decline, because saturated fats will activate the NOx enzymes, but the NOx enzymes will oxidize saturated fats into basically oxysterols. And then all these things work together so that vascular disease, which is the number one killer, things to do with the heart, the cardiovascular system. I mean, the thing you're most likely to die from is that. And so we see this trifecta of things going wrong in the endothelium, and it affects everything. It affects the ability of the junctions in the endothelium to hold together. And when that goes downhill, you're looking at, arterial sclerosis and all kinds of issues. Never mind, you just don't vasodilate anymore. And you could ascribe lots of ED, all kinds of things coming from that. So the loss of the ability to make nitric oxide in a healthy way tends to correlate very well with every pathology you can think of. And so a healthy endothelium is kind of front and center to aging well, and that's not a quick fix necessarily. You know, more often than not, in my opinion, it's the result of long-term patterns of diet that accumulate over years and years and years that contribute to the problem, and then you pass the tipping point where you just got real problems. So
Yeah. And that speaks to the last time, and I'll make the role of biological duality that you talked about, where, people say carbs are bad. No, fat's bad. Well, it's context dependent. Like, fats and, too much of anything is going to be bad. And I think being able to sit with a concept and understand like the context is super important. What you say?
yeah, unfortunately, the what you hear a lot on social media is very polarized. So you
Yeah.
hear this, like everybody was wrong. Cholesterol and saturated fats are good. There's no limit to what you could take in. Carbs are bad, or you hear the reverse. And it's all the problem with it is that it's all ignoring homeostasis of tissues, so that
Right.
tissues need to exist in a balance, and that balance can be disrupted by excessive inputs. So it
Right.
doesn't matter what the thing is, too much of something for too long can disrupt homeostasis, and that's really the true north. Is within, I mean, as you know, every tissue in the body exists in a fine balance, a highly tuned homeostasis. And
Right.
so, you know, the latest notion now, which is that, you know, we were wrong, so there's nothing wrong with cholesterol, saturated fats. Well, that's context dependent. Like maybe when you were young, you could probably eat a whole bunch of cholesterol and didn't affect anything. Saturated
Right.
fats didn't affect anything. But as you're older and these tissues are going downhill, it could be a real problem.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. That's awesome. Well, where can people find you? Is veepnutrition.com?
yeah, veepnutrition.com. There's a short URL, which is VICIC.health. And then I'm on Instagram at Real Joel Greene, and I'm starting Twitter or X, Real Joel Greene. And I have a failed TikTok where I got banned for some reason, or shadow banned, but I'm trying to bring that back. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Story. Yeah, that's almost everyone in the wellness space at some point. Thank you so much for the work you're doing, man. You're saving a lot of lives, and I really appreciate it. Hope you have a
thank you,
blessed
Doctor.
rest of your day.
You too. Thank you for having me on.
All right. Take care.